Okay. All right. So today I'll be presenting on my research that I'm grateful to have been provided with the funds to be able to carry this out, or at least to start this work in terms of collecting the data. So today I'll be presenting on my study, which is entitled Religious Coping and Years Living with HIV Among Black Women, a Developmental Trajectory. And my research advisor, I'm from the University of Miami, by the way. I'm a fourth-year clinical psychology student in the health track, and my research advisor is Dr. Sanisha Dale. Pleasure to be here. Okay. So I thought it might be helpful to start out by giving a sense of why I'm even interested in this topic. So essentially, a huge part of my interest came from anecdotal experiences, as well as what the literature was actually showing us in terms of religious coping among Black women. So I'm a research assistant, a graduate research assistant in the SHINE Research Lab, and we focus our work on intervention development studies among Black women living with HIV. So as a grad student, I'm primarily involved in doing clinical interviews with Black women living with HIV who typically have a history of trauma. So that's the population that we specialize in our research lab. And I was really struck by, over the past few years that I've spent working with them, I was really struck by the fact that a lot of the times when I discuss adaptive coping with them and discuss protective factors, religious coping is something that came up in almost every single clinical interview that I did. So women would make reference to their faith quite a bit, spiritual practices or religious practices like praying, reading scriptures, and it really seemed to be a source of strength and resilience for them, but that was only anecdotal. So that's what initially piqued my interest. And then eventually I did dive into the literature, and it was interesting because, historically, and I think it's widely known that among Black women specifically, not necessarily only living, not just Black women living with HIV, but that general population has historically been using religious coping as a resilience resource for decades. And, it dates as far back to slavery. Another interesting finding from the literature was that for specific health condition, the role of time in religious coping seemed to change. So for example, specific types of coping strategies seem to be used based on the time that had passed since a cancer diagnosis in some studies. And we also saw that the type of coping also seemed to vary within HIV positive populations. So that really begged the question for me of whether or not that remains the same for Black women living with HIV, because a lot of these populations were pretty racially heterogeneous. So that pretty much was my impetus for studying this topic. The two aims are, aim one is qualitative in nature, to explore the ways in which individuals cope with HIV by using religious faith as well as resilience and the perceived benefits of these coping strategies. The second aim was quantitative, so it sought to examine the predictive effect of years since an HIV diagnosis on religious coping and changes in religious coping across a 2-year time span during the COVID-19 pandemic. So how did I go about collecting this information? So the MAGIC study is the primary study that's being conducted within my research lab at the SHINE Research Lab. And essentially, it aims to monitor microaggressions and other types of psychosocial and mental health variables. So the MAGIC study is, as I said, it's a study being run in our research lab currently, and it's an ongoing cohort study. So we've been collecting data for the MAGIC study, quantitative data specifically, for the past 3 years at least. And so that, as I'll go on to explain, that will fulfill the requirements of the second aim of my project. But essentially, in the MAGIC study, I've included a copy of the study flyer here so you can have a sense of the eligibility criteria and some of the details regarding the study, what the participants are exposed to when they do see the flyer. But essentially, we have study visits every 3 months, and they come in, they do their study visits in person, and we collect survey data on a number of mental health and psychosocial outcomes. And so religious coping is one of those variables that we're able to garner data from during those 3-month follow-up visits. So the participant characteristics for this study, so the Mudryk study, by the way, is the parent study that I'm using to collect the quantitative portion of the data from. So that data already exists. Now, the participant characteristics for some of the analyses, the preliminary analyses that I'll be discussing with you, the mean age of the participants was 52 years. Approximately 40% of the participants had graduated high school or had a GED, 31% had attended some high school, and approximately 40% of the participants were earning between $5,000 and $12,000. And in terms of religious affiliations, most of our participants identified as Baptist, and then we had almost 30% who identified as, well, closer to 25% who identified as Christian more generally. And then the mean years since their HIV diagnosis was 22.53. So that just gives you a snapshot of what our participants looked like. So aim 1, which was qualitative, what we did was let me actually go back to identify that we did take a subsample. So the Mudryk study, the parent study, we collected data from 151 Black women living with HIV. And then we selected a subsample of 20 participants. Actually, we still are in the process of collecting data, which I'll allude to in a little bit more detail later on in my presentation. But the aim of aim 1 is to collect, to do semi-structured interviews with 20 of these Black women living with HIV. So as I mentioned, we have a qualitative subsample of 20. And what we've done is to actually, the sampling plan actually involves selecting 5 women from the first, second, third, and fourth quartiles in terms of their religious coping scores. So as I had mentioned, we already have that data from the Mudryk study. So we're just going to be using pretty much the quantitative to inform the sampling or the final sample from the qualitative portion of this study. And the thinking is that we'll get a very even or balanced distribution or variation in terms of different types of religious. So people who are high in religious coping, people who are at the lower end of the spectrum, and people who are pretty much moderate. So we will be conducting semi-structured interviews that look at religious coping more broadly, but some of the topics that are covered in the interview include examples of ways in which they have used religious coping strategies, benefits and disadvantages of these religious coping strategies. And we're also asking participants about other strategies that they've used that are not religious or spiritual in nature as well. We're also asking participants about ways in which they've coped in relation to their HIV diagnosis. So since they've been diagnosed with HIV, when they compare it retrospectively to pre-diagnosis, as well as how their coping has changed in relation to the pandemic, which has been a very salient reality for all of us for the past 2 years and counting. We also asked participants in the semi-structured interviews about resilience since their HIV diagnosis. So the data analysis plan for the qualitative data involves primarily thematic content analysis. Aim 2 is quantitative, as I had mentioned before, and the Mudryk study, we already have data collected from 151 Black women living with HIV. So we had a baseline, participants have provided baseline data in addition to follow-up assessments every 3 months. Some of the variables that we look at based on the survey data include demographic variables. That includes, but is not limited to, the number of years that have passed since their HIV diagnosis. And then we also ask about religious coping, and that was measured by the positive religious coping subscale, of the brief RCOPE, and that contains 5 items. We used fixed effects linear regressions for repeated measures in order to look at some of the differences between the baseline religious coping scores and subsequent study visits, which I'll talk about in a more graphic, by using some graphics in just a bit. Okay, so these are some preliminary themes that were derived from 3 interviews that have been conducted so far. So I just wanted to share them with you. So this grant was actually used to pay study participants compensation for their participation in AIM-1, the qualitative data. So the first preliminary theme that we're seeing here is prayer. So I've included a quote from participant 1 that says, "He," referring to God, "He is the only one that can fix my problems. So I take it to the Lord. Prayer changes everything." We also have the theme of independence or autonomy. So participant 3 shared, "I do more for myself. I do more for myself. I can do for myself. I don't have to depend on nobody to do it for me." We also saw the theme of medication adherence coming in as well. So participants pretty much shared that they adhere to their medication as a way to cope with living with HIV. So participant 2 says, "I don't let them bother me because I have HIV. I know how to take my medicine. I know I have it," referring to HIV, "and it's not going anywhere unless they get a cure. So why be stressed out? You can just cope with it. You can't beat it." So that participant pretty much described a state of mind in which she's distinguishing what she can control and what, for example, developing a cure, and what she can control, which is actually being adherent to her medication regimen. Some participants also shared an aversion to stress generally. So not really wanting to relate to stress as something that they're entertaining at a cognitive level, at an emotional level. So participant 2, for example, states, "I'm not stressed out. I don't let stress get me. It's many things you can do. There are many things you can do than get stressed out. Right now, people get stressed out for no reason. You don't have to be stressed out, pretty much." And then finally, so a theme that is directly related to this topic of religious or spiritual coping is relinquishing control to a higher power. So this participant says, "I forget about it. You know what's stressing me or whatever. I forget about it. I put it in God's hands. I put it in his hands and let it go. And let it go up. I shake it off." So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about some findings that we have from AIM-2. So AIM-1 data collection is in progress, but for AIM-2, I've actually highlighted some of the analyses I've done for a specific time period in the past. So this analysis was conducted based on data that was collected before these interviews were done. But I thought it might be useful to share just a sneak peek into what some of the patterns we're seeing. So this data was collected between October 2019 and February 2022. So the primary finding was that based on simple linear regressions, we did see that a higher number of years since an HIV diagnosis significantly predicted higher religious coping. So that's what we found at the most basic level. So after conducting some fixed effects linear regressions for repeated measures, what we did was to compare religious coping at all post-baseline visits. So visits 2 going to visits 10, and comparing those to the scores that they got, that the participants received at baseline on religious coping. So you'll see here that there was a significant difference between religious coping at visit 4 compared to baseline, and also a significant difference between religious coping scores at visit 5 compared to baseline. We also saw a significant difference between baseline scores and visit 9. And these are findings that I've actually presented at ABCT's most recent conference in November of last year, for which I received the Student Poster Award within the Behavioral Medicine and Integrated Primary Care SIG. So the good thing about this is that I am able to share this information and disseminate in some way, even though it is in progress. But as I said, because it's an ongoing cohort study, the data is available depending on what time points I choose to use. But ultimately, we will be looking at qualitative and quantitative data that were collected concurrently. So this is a follow-up graphic to the table that I just showed. So remember that I had highlighted that visits 4, 5, and 9 actually had significantly different scores in religious coping when compared to baseline. And what we did find when we looked at what was happening in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic at that time was that during these periods, when participants were doing study visits 4, 5, and 9, they were actually peak periods of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, when rates and numbers related to COVID-19 were actually higher in the Miami-Dade area. And so, and as you can see here in January, pretty much the spring of 2020 was when Miami started having their first cases of COVID. And then we had our peak period. So it was interesting to see that, you know, some of the significant differences between the baseline visits and subsequent study visits actually coincided with peak periods in the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, these analyses are just preliminary, but I think it is pretty interesting and informative for some of the work, like further analyses that can be done with the quantitative data that I have so far. So what's next? I do hope to present the full body of this work. So I've presented at ABCT the quantitative findings. So once I collect the qualitative data, I'm hoping to present this work at a conference, so as a mixed method study. And then also submitting to a peer-reviewed journal, for example, AIDS Care or AIDS and Behavior. What are some challenges that I've faced? So I really have had a pretty smooth run for the most part. I think this slide is a little bit, I really had to think through. And of course, I'm in the early stages of collecting. I've only collected data from 3 participants so far. So I'm still in the early stages. But feedback that I've gotten so far from the participants themselves are that they would appreciate a higher reimbursement. So right now we're paying them $30 per study visit, per qualitative interview. And of course, you know, that's something for a future study I would love to be able to, I'd love to be able to honor that, you know, because their time is so, I don't take for granted the effort and the sacrifice it takes for them to be a part of this work and to talk about these vulnerable issues. Some of the challenges also included just, I frame it as a challenge, but I think it's just something that you learn as you go, just how to develop good administrative skills, you know, developing and maintaining spreadsheets in order to keep accurate records related to finances. And I also think maybe the biggest challenge that I had was trying to figure out a way to pay participants who were doing the interviews remotely, because they're very specific. So for example, I use Venmo in order to pay participants, but as an electronic method, but many of them don't have the Venmo app. And even if they did download the app, they have a little bit of the technical, there are some technical issues with even getting used to using that type of payment method. If they didn't have the app downloaded, sometimes they may ask their children to help them, you know, because they may not be as comfortable with technology and with using electronic payment methods. So I definitely found payment easiest when participants were paid in cash because they came in person. So I think I'm still thinking through how to work out payment methods so that participants who do interviews remotely can comfortably get the money. So whether an electronic gift card, that's another option that can be used as well. But I know there are often delays in getting electronic gift cards transmitted to a mailing address whereas Venmo is like instant payments. What was helpful? I'm really grateful for the support of not just my research advisor, Dr. Dale, but the entire lab team. I think we have a really good synergy going. And because I'm collecting qualitative data from a subsample of a parent study, it really requires a lot of coordination with my team members, communication, responsiveness. And I think we do work well together, and I've really had a lot of support from them for instances where I'm not in person, for example, or if communication has to be done via telephone or via messaging. They really have been very supportive. So I'm grateful for that, and just for the guidance from Dr. Dale as well, my advisor. I also have good rapport with the study participants because these are women that I have been working with, or I've been working with in a clinical context, clinical research context for about 3 years. So they do, we have a relationship, and there's a specific level of comfort that I think helps it just builds rapport, and it helps it just makes for a really positive experience from both of us. And I think, for Black women living with HIV specifically, when it comes to the research context, some people may not be as open on that initial encounter because, medical mistrust is real. And, I'm in the health clinical context. So sometimes I think we can, as researchers, we can be associated with the medical profession or the medical field, even though we're not doctors. So I think it really helps to convey the warmth and just that safe space that we want to create for our participants. I also think that having experience collecting data, sorry for this typo, and managing logistics for study visits, for other visits that we've done in our lab has been very helpful in making this a pretty seamless process so far. So I am finished with this presentation. I just want to say a huge thank you, of course, to our study participants. There would be no research without them. The SHINE team, our community partners that help us with recruitment and just building and establishing relationships with a number of different HIV-related community-based agencies. Also NIMH funding, because the MAGIC study the current phase of the study is funded by Dr. Dale's R01, and she previously had an R56. And of course, thank you to APA Division 36 Social Justice Task Force for providing me with the funding to conduct this work. Thank you.
And hi, participants. Okay. Well, hey everyone, thank you for coming in today, especially on a Thursday, to hear more about the work being done through the Social Justice Task Force. My name is Elijah Mudryk, and this project is on parallel pathways to civic engagement among African and Latin Americans. There we go. So just to make sure we're all on the same page with the key terms within this project, critical consciousness is the ability to recognize systems of inequality and motivation to take action against them. Religiousness, in this case, can be defined as behaviors and beliefs that are informed by spiritual teachings. And then civic engagement is behaviors to advance social conditions for larger groups of people. So civic engagement is something we're seeing at a very prevalent, passionate, and public level in the United States right now. It's multifaceted and can take roots through blogs, public demonstrations, community building projects, fundraisers, mentoring programs, or public safety initiatives. And it comes from the roots of people who have seen difficult times and are trying to change conditions for those around them, above them, and just really raise awareness. And because it comes from these people who have seen difficult times, it really incorporates the skills and strategies that they already know, the artists who create murals to raise awareness, the bloggers who can write, and they say, this is our way of interacting and changing conditions for people around us. So it ties well into the action stage of critical consciousness, which was developed by Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator who conducted interviews and large-scale studies on pathways to liberation and forms of resistance in Latin America. So at the core of it is, oh, I realize you can't see where I'm pointing. So at the core of it is critical consciousness, and it occurs in 3 separate stages. So the first is critical reflection, which is just the process of reevaluating and challenging one's understandings of disparity. This proceeds to critical motivation, the commitment to challenging these disparities based on your perceptions of your own capacity and your own values for what makes you want to take action against them. This reflection and motivation leads to critical action, which is tangible behaviors that we see to engage with and change these social systems. So my primary interest for this project, and hopefully in a later career, is to really explore how religiousness fosters into this process of critical consciousness. So in a study last year, Benales et al. Explored critical reflection among African and Latin Americans and found different pathways to civic engagement where this critical awareness led to civic action among both of them. But I believe it was Latin Americans used it more for words voting, but that same awareness and reflection was not observed for African Americans. So since Benales has already done the reflection stage, I'm very curious about how religiousness can serve as its motivation to become involved. And this is especially relevant for African American and Latin American communities because throughout history, religiousness has served as a source of community, source of resilience, and a source of connection. It's also highly prevalent within both communities, to a strong majority per the Pew survey released last year. And so existing research has tied religiousness to increase involvement with one's own community. I just really like to concretize this within the present study. But we all know that beyond certain denominations, even within denominations and across religions, there are different ways religiousness can be understood. And so a good framework I found to understand this came from Bowman in 2016. She conducted ethnographic observations of different churches and religious institutions to kind of understand how their teachings and their orientations led to action within the community. So at the top left, you have social prophetic, where race is often the central theme, and the church engages in recurring engagements in politics and social justice efforts. Social priestly focuses less on race, and charity is really the dominant focus, where the institution directs its social efforts at the local community level. Prosperity prophetic, the central focus is on religious identity and alliance with similar religious groups, more of a colorblind approach where they just say we are all X and X religion and we're trying to help our brothers and sisters no matter where they may be. And finally, you have prosperity priestly, where spirituality is a central component and many activities of the institution are catered towards reading scripture and traditional religious behaviors such as ceremonies. And then there's also non-religious, people who don't identify with a particular religion. So even though religiousness is an ignored factor among minorities, there are a handful of other factors that do align with the critical motivation stage that is the focus of this study. In particular, the sense of community, that kinship and connection with others, ethnic identity, identification with other members of the in-group, general self-efficacy, that ties in more into your belief in your own ability to overcome challenges, putting this more at the person level versus more of that social level. So the curiosity arose in that they're conventionally associated with critical motivation, but how do they compare to religiousness? And that ties into the guiding question of the study. Well, one of them, primary one being what motivates African and Latin Americans towards civic engagement in their communities. And then how does religiousness compare to these other motivating factors? So stemming from that, the hypotheses in this study were after controlling for religious orientation, religiousness would predict higher levels of civic engagement among African and Latin Americans. And then ethnic identity, sense of community, and self-efficacy would produce lower rates of civic engagement when compared to religiousness. And to briefly go into the measures used for this study, these were two of the predictors, the 4 basic dimensions of religiousness scale, the sample item of that being I'm attached to the religion for the values and ethics it endorses, the multi-ethnic identity measure, examining that kinship with members of one's in-group. I have a strong sense of belonging to my own ethnic group. For more of the predictors, there is the brief sense of community scale, just exploring the alliance and sense of connection with the community around them. This neighborhood helps me fulfill my needs. And finally, the general self-efficacy scale. I can usually handle whatever comes my way. The outcome variable in this study was captured through the civic engagement scale. And that just explores actions and attitudes towards tangible behaviors that people engage in through the community, such as participate in discussions that raise issues of social responsibility. So data was collected through Prolific after using a screener for African and Latin Americans. Participants were briefed, consented, and then the survey was administered in a counterbalanced order just to screen a little for fatigue effects. I also use an intention check to screen out some random responding. And anyone who's more than 2 standard deviations below the mean response time was disqualified for taking the survey at an impossibly fast rate. And these were studied through independent samples t-test to explore just basic differences, and then separate hierarchical regression for the main hypotheses. So just to look at the demographics of this study, I'm going to try to split these more into African American and Latin American to explore what's true for these ethnicities on their own terms. The one at the top is just to give a broader idea of who is involved within the study. And so on the left, we have African Americans. There was a higher number of them because I think some of the Latin American ones, they were outside of the United States, so I couldn't use that data. But they're roughly comparable numbers, with African Americans having a slightly higher sample size. Age was roughly equal, along with the age range, with African Americans having an upper limit just above at 80 years compared to 69. And there were slightly more males within the African American study, but then number of females was roughly comparable. So these are the results of the t-test. And so just where it's bolded on the top right here, was just showing where significant differences were observed. And so African Americans showed significantly higher levels of religiousness compared to Latin Americans, and significantly higher levels of ethnic identity. That's conventionally coming more into this study of how I thought to explore differences between the groups. And that's more of a horizontal approach. What my mentor encouraged me is to try to make that vertical. We know that African Americans and Latin Americans are different in some ways. All that really tells us is that they're different. Examining the both as their own constructs, and one analysis just for African Americans, another just for Latin Americans, that's looking more at what is true for each group, treating them as a main variable. And that was just kind of the light bulb moment that really set my motivation, my personal motivation for this study. And so these are the results of the hierarchical regression for African Americans. And then just where the 2 stars are, that just indicates where the p-value is less than 0.01. And so in step 1, religious orientation was significant as a control variable. And then overall, the religiousness, ethnic identity, and sense of community were significant sources of critical action among African Americans. And so ethnic identity was the strongest factor, followed by sense of community, and then religion was significant and just came in third there. I'll just give a second for everyone to kind of look at any information they want just within that chart. Okay, and moving forward. So for Latin Americans, no of the factors that were entered within step 1 were found to be significant, and religiousness was not significant in this case as a critical motivation factor. However, ethnic identity was, along with sense of community and self-efficacy. And again, ethnic identity was the strongest factor, and then community and self-efficacy came in at comparable rates. Okay, and moving forward there. So my main takeaways from this is that there are different calls to action, calls to engagement within communities, and that these have different presentations for Latin Americans and African Americans. What was common between them is that ethnic identity and sense of community had very salient and prominent effects. However, religiousness was prominent and present for African Americans. This was absent for Latin Americans, but they showed that self-efficacy was a motivating factor, that belief in their own capacity to make a difference within the community. And my favorite takeaway from this is that it really does make the case for increased recognition of religiousness, of spirituality, as this motivating force, this sense of altruism to become involved with the people around you, that there's belief and there's faith, and there's works. And that faith without works can sometimes ring hollow. And that's sometimes a perception given against people with religious orientations. This gives support that it can be used as a constructive and transformative force. So when applying for this grant, as I was speaking to a bit earlier, there was that kind of bias where it can be easy to homogenize or have a blanket approach when viewing minority cultures of just, okay, let's see what civic engagement looks like for minorities. And so I'm very grateful to my mentor, Dr. Laura Johnson, for saying just don't look at differences, look at what is true, pretend in each analysis that they are the only people in the world and see what comes up from that. And trying to concretize my ideas and put them in this study, that was a very useful thing because it just gives so much more room for application within research and when disseminating this to social justice groups. And then as a person of color too, especially in today where there is quite a bit of identity politics, people questioning their role, how they engage with or are part of different systems that really impact other people. I tried to understand what it means to be a religious scientist studying that and how useful could I really be. I read books and I write numbers. This was useful to apply for the grant and to find these results because it can be empowering for communities to know what they can use to call to others, to join them in their efforts, to know what really sings to the hearts of people. It makes them want to become involved. And I'm just very happy that as a scientist, I can have some role in that and be engaged with a talent and a skill and a passion that I have that, you know, being a book nerd and being an activist can sometimes meet in the middle. So for future directions, I'm hoping to submit these results for publication. I'm thinking one of these journals here, ideally the Journal of Community Psychology could be a really good one. And then I'd like to follow this up by combining measures of critical reflection and motivation into one study, and then examining the results for structural equation modeling. And then conducting a follow-up study too, where I'm having people rank or just write out what they think the most important issues are. And then just seeing which issues are often written as the top issue and seeing how that ties into different factors for motivation and critical action. You know, if this is so important to you, how does this impact how you vote, how you relate with others, how you become involved? And those are some of the references. And that is my thanks.